Alchemists, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas Life Alchemist, and I'm here for another week, week 12 of The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. If you are just joining us, welcome. You probably want to start from video one, week one, because I am reading this book and we're over halfway through. Yeah, so I'm going to be picking up from where I left off last week. Any announcements? My book for personal readings is open again, so I will be doing oracle readings. That's open, and you will find my booking link below in the description box along with my email. If we get to any point in this video and you are resonating with the content, you like it, you have any comments, please drop a comment below, share any experience that you might have that you feel you are comfortable sharing. I love seeing how you all are connecting through like live chats and comments. It's really, really cool. And it's like feeling the love and support that you all give to each other, not only to me, but to each other it's priceless. It's awesome. So please do not hesitate to comment, like the video if you like it, share this with anyone that you feel may resonate or may benefit from the information in this book. And if you have not subscribed, I would love to have you subscribe to the tribe. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we are picking up on page 217. This is subsection 6 called Taking Action. The body responds to extreme experiences by secreting stress hormones. These are often blamed for subsequent illness and disease. However, stress hormones are meant to give us the strength and endurance to respond to extraordinary conditions. People who actively do something to deal with a disaster, rescuing loved ones or strangers, transporting people to a hospital, or being part of a medical team, pitching tents, or cooking meals, utilize their stress hormones for their proper purpose, and therefore are at much lower risk of becoming traumatized. Nonetheless, everyone has his or her breaking point, and even the best prepared person may become overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge. Helplessness and immobilization keep people from utilizing their stress hormones to defend themselves. When that happens, their hormones are still being pumped out, but the actions they're supposed to fuel are thwarted. Eventually, the activation patterns that were meant to promote coping are turned back against the organism and now keep fueling inappropriate fight, flight, and freeze responses. In order to return to proper functioning, this persistent emergency response must come to an end. The body needs to be restored to a baseline state of safety and relaxation from which it can mobilize to take action in response to real danger. My friends and teachers, Pat Ogden and Peter Levine, have each developed powerful body-based therapies, sensory motor psychotherapy, and somatic experiencing to deal with this issue. In these treatment approaches, the story of what has happened takes a backseat to exploring physical sensations and discovering the location and shape of the imprints of past trauma on the body. Before plunging into a full-fledged exploration of the trauma itself, patients are helped to build up internal resources that foster safe access, sensations, and emotions that overwhelm them at the time of the trauma. Peter Levine calls this process pendulation, gently moving in and out of accessing internal sensations and traumatic memories. In this way, patients are helped to gradually expand their window of tolerance. Once patients can tolerate being aware of their trauma-based physical experiences, they are likely to discover powerful physical impulses like hitting, pushing, or running that arose during the trauma but were suppressed in order to survive. These impulses manifest themselves in subtle body movements such as twisting, turning, or backing away. Amplifying these movements and experimenting with ways to modify them begins the process of bringing the incomplete trauma-related action tendencies to completion and can eventually lead to resolution of the trauma. Somatic therapies can help patients to relocate themselves in the present by experiencing that it is safe to move. Feeling the pleasure of taking effective action restores a sense of agency and a sense of being able to actively defend and protect themselves. Back in 1893, Pierre Genet, the first great explorer of trauma, wrote about the pleasure of completed action. And I regularly observe that pleasure when I practice sensory motor psychotherapy and somatic experiencing. When patients can physically experience what it would have felt like to fight back or run away, they relax, smile, and express a sense of completion. When people are forced to submit to overwhelming power, as is true for most abused children, women trapped in domestic violence, and incarcerated men and women, they often survive with resigned compliance. The best way to overcome ingrained patterns of submission is to restore a physical capacity to engage and defend. One of my favorite body-oriented ways to build effective fight-flight response is our local impact center's model mugging program, in which women and increasingly men are taught to actively fight off a simulated attack. The program started in Oakland, California in 1971 after a woman with a fifth-degree black belt in karate was raped. Wondering how this could have happened to someone who supposedly could kill with her bare hands, her friends concluded that she had become de-skilled by fear. In the terms of this book, her executive functions, her frontal lobes, went offline and she froze. The model mugging program teaches women to recondition the freeze response through many repetitions of being placed in the 0 hour, a military term for the precise moment of attack, and learn to transform fear into positive fighting energy. One of my patients, a college student with a history of unrelenting child abuse, took the course. When I first met her, she was collapsed, depressed, and overly compliant. 3 months later, during her graduation ceremony, she successfully fought off a gigantic male attacker who ended up lying cringing on the floor, shielded from her blows by a thick protective suit, while she faced him, arms raised in a karate stance, calmly and clearly yelling no. Not long afterward, she was walking home from the library after midnight when 3 men jumped out from some bushes, yelling, "Bitch, give us your money." She later told me that she took the same karate stance and yelled back, "Okay, guys, I've been looking forward to this moment. Who wants to take me on first?" They ran away. If you're hunched over and too afraid to look around, you are easy prey to other people's sadism. But when you walk around projecting the message, "Don't mess with me," you're not likely to be bothered. We are on the next section called Integrating Traumatic Memories on page 219. People cannot put traumatic events behind until they are able to acknowledge what has happened and start to recognize the invisible demons they're struggling with. Traditional psychotherapy has focused mainly on constructing a narrative that explains why a person feels a particular way, or Sigmund Freud put it back in 1914 in Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through. While the patient lives the trauma through as something real and actual, we have to accomplish the therapeutic task, which consists chiefly of translating it back again in terms of the past. Telling the story is important. Without stories, memory becomes frozen, and without memory, you cannot imagine how things can be different. But as we saw in part 4, telling a story about the event does not guarantee that the traumatic memories will be laid to rest. There is a reason for that. When people remember an ordinary event, they do not also relive the physical sensations, emotions, images, smells, or sounds associated with that event. In contrast, when people fully recall their traumas, they have the experience. They are engulfed by the sensory or emotional elements of the past. The brain scam of Stan and UD Lawrence, the accident victims in chapter 4, show how this happens. When Stan was remembering his horrendous accident, 2 key areas in his brain went blank. The area that provided a sense of time and perspective, which makes it possible to know that was then, but I'm safe now. And another area that integrates the images, sounds, and sensations of trauma into a coherent story. When those parts of the brain are knocked out, you experience something not as an event with a beginning, middle, and an end, but in fragments of sensations, images, and emotions. A trauma can be successfully processed only if all those brain structures are kept online. In Stan's case, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, allowed him to access his memories of the accident without being overwhelmed by them. When the brain areas whose absence is responsible for flashbacks can be kept online while remembering what has happened, people can integrate their traumatic memories as belonging to the past. Beauty's dissociation, as you recall, she shut down completely, complicated recovery in a different way. None of the brain structures necessary to engage in the present were online, so that dealing with the trauma was simply impossible. Without a brain that is alert and present, there can be no integration and resolution. She needed to be helped to increase her window of tolerance before she could deal with her PTSD symptoms. Hypnosis was the most widely practiced treatment for trauma from the late 1800s, the time of Pierre Janet and Sigmund Freud, until after World War II. On YouTube, you can still watch the documentary Let There Be Light by the great Hollywood director John Huston, which shows men undergoing hypnosis to treat war neurosis. Hypnosis fell out of favor in the early 1990s, and there have been no recent studies of its effectiveness for treating PTSD. However, hypnosis can induce a state of relative calm from which patients can observe their traumatic experiences without being overwhelmed by them. Since that capacity to quietly observe oneself is a critical factor in the integration of traumatic memories, it is likely that hypnosis in some form will make a comeback. We are on to a new section on page 220 called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, or CBT. During their training, most psychologists are taught cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT was first developed to treat phobias such as fear of spiders, airplanes, or heights to help patients compare their irrational fears with harmless realities. Patients are gradually desensitized from their irrational fears by bringing to mind what they are most afraid of, using their narratives and images. Imaginal exposure, or they are placed in actual but actually safe anxiety-provoking situations. In vivo exposure, or they are exposed to virtual reality, computer-simulated scenes, for example, in the case of combat-related PTSD, fighting in the streets of Fallujah. The idea behind cognitive behavioral treatment is that when patients are repeatedly exposed to the stimulus without bad things actually happening, they gradually will become less upset. The memories will have become associated with corrective information of being safe. CBT also tries to help patients deal with their tendency to avoid, as in, I don't want to talk about it. It sounds simple, but as we have seen, reliving trauma reactivates the brain's alarm system and knocks out critical brain areas necessary for integrating the past, making it likely that patients will relive rather than resolve the trauma. Prolonged exposure, or flooding, has been studied more thoroughly than any other PTSD treatment. Patients are asked to focus their attention on the traumatic material and not distract themselves with other thoughts or activities. Research has shown that up to 100 minutes of flooding, in which anxiety-provoking triggers are presented in an intense, sustained form, are required before decreases in anxiety are reported. Exposure sometimes helps to deal with fear and anxiety, but it has not been proven to help with guilt or other complex emotions. In contrast to its effectiveness for irrational fears such as spiders, CBT has not done so well for traumatized individuals, particularly those with histories of childhood abuse. Only about 1 in 3 participants with PTSD who finished research studies show some improvement. Those who complete CBT treatment usually have fewer PTSD symptoms, but they rarely recover completely. Most continue to have substantial problems with their health, work, or mental well-being. In the largest published study of CBT for PTSD, more than 1/3 of the patients dropped out. The rest had a significant number of adverse reactions. Most of the women in the study still suffered from full-blown PTSD after 3 months in the study, or PTSD after 3 months in the study, and only 15% no longer had PTSD symptoms. A thorough analysis of all the scientific studies of CBT show that it works about as well as being in a supportive therapy relationship. The poorest outcome in exposure treatments occurs in patients who suffer from mental defeat, those who have given up. Being traumatized is not just an issue of being stuck in the past, it is just as much a problem of not being fully alive in the present. One form of exposure treatment is virtual reality therapy, in which veterans wear high-tech goggles that make it possible to refight the battle of Fallujah in lifelike detail. As far as I know, the U.S. Marines perform very well in combat. The problem is that they cannot tolerate being home. Recent studies of Australian combat veterans show that their brains are rewired to be alert for emergencies at the expense of being focused on the small details of everyday life. We'll learn more about this in Chapter 19 on neurofeedback. More than virtual reality therapy, traumatized patients need real-world therapy, which helps them to feel as alive when walking through the local supermarket or playing with their kids as they did in the streets of Baghdad. Patients can benefit from reliving their trauma only if they are not overwhelmed by it. A good example of a study in Vietnam of Vietnam veterans conducted in the early 1990s by my colleague, Roger Pittman. I visited Roger's lab every week during that time, since we were conducting the study of brain opioids and PTSD that I discussed in Chapter 2. Roger would show me the videotapes of his treatment sessions, and we would discuss what we observed. He and his colleagues pushed the veterans to talk repeatedly about every detail of their experiences in Vietnam. But the investigators had to stop the study because many patients became panicked by their flashbacks, and the dread often persisted after the sessions. Some never returned, while many of those who stayed with the study became more depressed, violent, and fearful. Some coped with their increased symptoms by increasing their alcohol consumption, which led to further violence and humiliation, as some of their families called the police to take them to a hospital. Next section on page 222. This is called desensitization. Over the past 2 decades, the prevailing treatment taught to psychology students has been some form of systematic desensitization, helping patients become less reactive to certain emotions and sensations. But is this the correct goal? Maybe the issue is not desensitization, but integration, putting the traumatic event into its proper place in the overall arc of one's life. Desensitization makes me think about the small boy. He must have been about 5, I saw in front of my house recently. His hulking father was yelling at him at the top of his voice as the boy rode his tricycle down my street. The kid was unfazed while my heart was racing and I felt an impulse to deck the guy. How much brutality had it taken to numb a child this young to his father's brutality? His indifference to his father's yelling must have been the result of prolonged exposure, but I wondered at what price. Yes, we can take drugs to blunt our emotions, or we can learn to desensitize ourselves. As medical students, we learned to stay analytical when we had to treat children with third-degree burns. But as the neuroscientist Jean Desensitization at the University of Chicago has shown, desensitization to our own or to other people's pain tends to lead to an overall blunting of emotional sensitivity. A 2010 report on 49,425 veterans with newly diagnosed PTSD from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who sought care from the VA showed that fewer than 1 out of 10 actually completed the recommended treatment. As in Pittman's Vietnam veterans, exposure treatment, as currently practiced, rarely works for them. We can only process horrendous experiences if they do not overwhelm us. And that means that other approaches are necessary. Next section, page 223, this is called Drugs to Safely Access Trauma. When I was a medical student, I spent the summer of 1966 working for Jan Bastiaans, a professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands, who was known for his work treating Holocaust survivors with LSD. He claimed to have achieved spectacular results, but when colleagues inspected his archives, they found few data to support his claims. The potential of mind-altering substances for trauma treatment was subsequently neglected until 2000, when Michael Mithoefer and his colleagues in South Carolina received FDA permission to conduct an experiment with MDMA, or ecstasy. MDMA MDMA was classified as a controlled substance in 1985 after having been used for years as a recreational drug. As with Prozac and other psychotropic agents, we don't know exactly how MDMA works, but it is known to increase concentrations of a number of important hormones, including oxytocin, vasopressin, cortisol, and prolactin. Most relevant for trauma treatment, it increases people's awareness of themselves. They frequently report a heightened sense of compassionate energy, accompanied by curiosity, clarity, confidence, creativity, and connectedness. Mithofer and his colleagues were looking for a medication that would enhance the effectiveness of psychotherapy, and they became interested in MDMA because it decreases fear, defensiveness, and numbing, as well as helping to access inner experience. They thought MDMA might enable patients to stay within the window of tolerance so they could revisit their traumatic memories without suffering overwhelming physiological and emotional arousal. The initial pilot studies have supported that expectation. The first study involving combat veterans, firefighters, and police officers with PTSD had positive results. In the next study, a group of 20 victims of assault who had been unresponsive to previous forms of therapy, 12 subjects received MDMA and 8 received an inactive placebo. Sitting or lying in a comfortable room, then they all received 2 8-hour psychotherapy sessions, mainly using internal family systems or IFS therapy, the subject of chapter 17 in this book. 2 months later, 83% of the patients who received MDMA plus psychotherapy were considered completely cured, compared with 25% of the placebo group. None of the patients had adverse side effects. Perhaps most interesting was when the patients were interviewed more than a year after the study was completed, they had maintained their gains. By being able to observe the trauma from the calm, mindful state that IFS calls self, a term I'll discuss further in chapter 17, mind and brain are in a position to integrate the trauma into the overall fabric of life. This is very different from traditional desensitization techniques, which are about blunting a person's response to past horrors. This is about association and integration, making a horrendous event that overwhelmed you in the past into a memory of something that happened a long time ago. Nonetheless, psychedelic substances are powerful agents with a troubled history. They can easily be misused through careless administration and poor maintenance of therapeutic boundaries. It is to be hoped that MDMA will not be another magic cure released from Pandora's box. And next section called What About Medications on page 224. People have always used drugs to deal with traumatic stress. Each culture and each generation has its preferences: gin, vodka, beer, or whiskey, hashish, marijuana, cannabis, or ganja, cocaine, opioids like Oxycontin, tranquilizers such as Valium, Xanax, and Klonopin. When people are desperate, they will do just about anything to feel calmer and more in control. Mainstream psychiatry follows this tradition. Over the past decade, the Departments of Defense and Veterans Affairs combined have spent over $4.5 billion on antidepressants, antipsychotics, and anti-anxiety drugs. A June 2010 internal report from the Defense Department's Pharmacoeconomic Center at Fort Sam Houston and San Antonio showed that 213,972, or 20% of the 1.1 million active duty troops surveyed, were taking some form of psychotropic drug, antidepressants, antipsychotics, sedative, hypnotics, or other controlled substances. However, drugs cannot cure trauma. They can only dampen the expressions of a disturbed physiology. And they do not teach the lasting lessons of self-regulation. They can help to control feelings and behavior, but always at a price, because they work by blocking the chemical systems that regulate engagement, motivation, pain, and pleasure. Some of my colleagues remain optimistic. I keep attending meetings where serious scientists discuss their quest for the elusive magic bullet that will miraculously reset the fear circuits of the brain, as if traumatic stress involved only one simple brain circuit. I also regularly prescribe medications. Just about every group of psychotropic agents has been used to treat some aspect of PTSD. The serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, such as Prozac, Zoloft, Effexor, and Paxil, have been most thoroughly studied, and they can make feelings less intense and life more manageable. Patients on SSRIs often feel calmer and more in control. Feeling less overwhelmed often makes it easier to engage in therapy. Other patients feel blunted by SSRIs. They feel they're losing their edge. I approach it as an empirical question. Let's see what works, and only the patient can be the judge of that. On the other hand, if one SSRI doesn't work, it's worth trying another because they all have slightly different effects. It's interesting that the SSRIs are widely used to treat depression, but in a study in which we compared Prozac with eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, for patients with PTSD, many of whom were also depressed, EMDR proved to be a more effective antidepressant than Prozac. I'll return to that subject in chapter 15. Medicines that target the autonomic nervous system, like propranolol or clonidine, can help to decrease hyperarousal and reactivity to stress. This family of drugs works by blocking the physical effects of adrenaline, the fuel of arousal, and thus reduces nightmares, insomnia, and reactivity to trauma triggers. Blocking adrenaline can help to keep the rational brain online and make choices possible. Is it really what I want to do? Since I have started to integrate mindfulness and yoga into my practice, I use these medications less often, except occasionally to help patients sleep more restfully. Traumatized patients tend to like tranquilizing drugs. Benzodiazepines like Klonopin, Valium, Xanax, and Ativan. In many ways, they work like alcohol in that they make people feel calm and keep them from worrying. Casino owners love customers on benzodiazepines. They don't get upset when they lose and keep gambling. But also, like alcohol, benzos weaken inhibitions against saying hurtful things to people we love. Most civilian doctors are reluctant to prescribe these drugs because they have a high addiction potential, and they may also interfere with trauma processing. Patients who stop taking them after prolonged use usually have withdrawal reactions that make them agitated and increase post-traumatic symptoms. I sometimes give my patients low doses of benzodiazepines to use as needed, but not enough to take on a daily basis. They have to choose when to use up their precious supply, and I ask them to keep a diary of what was going on when they decided to take the pill. That gives us a chance to discuss the specific incidents that triggered them. A few studies have shown that anticonvulsants and mood destabilizers such as lithium and valproate can have mildly positive effects, taking the edge of hyperarousal and panic, taking the edge off hyperarousal and panic. The most controversial medications are so-called second-generation antipsychotic agents, such as risperidol and Seroquel, the largest selling psychiatric drugs in the United States, $14.6 billion in 2008. Low doses of these agents can be helpful in calming down combat veterans and women with PTSD related to childhood abuse. Using these drugs is sometimes justified, for example, when patients feel completely out of control and unable to sleep, or where other methods have failed. But it's important to keep in mind that these medications work by blocking the dopamine system, the brain's reward system, which also functions as the engine of pleasure and motivation. Antipsychotic medications such as risperidol, Abilify, and Seroquel can significantly dampen the emotional brain and thus make patients less skittish or enraged. But they also may interfere with being able to appreciate subtle signals of pleasure, danger, or satisfaction. They also cause weight gain, increase the chance of developing diabetes, and make patients physically inert. which is likely to further increase their sense of alienation. These drugs are widely used to treat abused children who are inappropriately diagnosed with bipolar disorder or mood dysregulation disorder. More than 500,000 children and adolescents in America are now taking antipsychotic drugs, which may calm them down, but also interfere with learning age-appropriate skills and developing friendships with other children. A Columbia University study recently found that prescriptions of antipsychotic drugs for privately insured 2 to 5-year-olds had doubled between 2000 and 2007. Only 40% of them had received a proper mental health assessment. Until it lost its patent, the pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson doled out Lego blocks stamped with the word Risperdal for the waiting rooms in child psychiatrists. Children from low-income families are 4 times more likely as the privately insured to receive antipsychotic medications. In 1 year alone, Texas Medicaid spent $96 million on antipsychotic drugs for teenagers and children, including 3 unidentified infants who were given the drugs before their first birthdays. Dear God. There have been no studies on the effects of psychotropic medications on the developing brain. Dissociation, self-mutilation, fragmented memories, and amnesia generally do not respond to any of these medications. The Prozac study that I discussed in Chapter 2 was the first to discover that traumatized civilians tend to respond much better to medications than do combat veterans. Since then, other studies have found similar discrepancies. In this light, it is worrisome that the Department of Defense and the VA prescribe enormous quantities of medications to combat soldiers and returning veterans, often without providing other forms of therapy. Between 2001 and 2011, the VA spent about $1.5 billion on Seroquel and Risperdal, while Defense spent about $90 million during the same period, even though a research paper published in 2001 showed that Risperdal was no more effective than a placebo in treating PTSD. Similarly, between 2001 and 2012, the VA spent $72.1 million and Defense spent $44.1 million in benzodiazepines, medications that clinicians generally avoid prescribing to civilians with PTSD because their addiction potential and lack of significant effectiveness for PTSD symptoms. It's a lot of money. Okay, next section on page 227 called The Road of Recovery is the Road of Life. In the first chapter of this book, I introduced you to a patient named Bill, whom I met over 30 years ago at the VA. Bill became one of my longtime patient teachers, and our relationship is also the story of my evolution of trauma treatment. Bill had served as a medic in Vietnam in 1967 to 1971. And after he returned, he tried to use the skills he had learned in the Army by working on a burn unit in a local hospital. Nursing kept him frazzled, explosive, and on edge, but he had no idea that these problems had anything to do with what he experienced in Vietnam. After all, the PTSD diagnosis did not yet exist, and Irish working class guys in Boston didn't consult shrinks. His nightmares and insomnia subsided a bit after he left nursing and enrolled in a seminary to become a minister. He did not seek help until after his first son was born in 1978. The baby's crying triggered unrelenting flashbacks in which he saw, heard, and smelled burned and mutilated children in Vietnam. He was so out of control that some of my colleagues at the VA wanted to put him in the hospital to treat what they thought was a psychosis. However, as he and I started to work together and he began to feel safe with me, he gradually opened up about what he had witnessed in Vietnam, and he slowly started to tolerate his feelings without becoming overwhelmed. This helped him to refocus on taking care of his family and on finishing his training as a minister. After 2 years, he was a pastor with his own parish, and we felt that our work was done. I had no further contact with Bill until he called me up 18 years to the day after I first met him. He was experiencing exactly the same symptoms: flashbacks, terrible nightmares, feelings that he was going crazy, that he'd had right after his baby was born. That son had just turned 18, and Bill had accompanied him to register for the draft at the same armory from which Bill himself had been shipped off to Vietnam. By then, I knew much more about treating traumatic stress, and Bill and I dealt with the specific memories of what he had seen, heard, and smelled back in Vietnam, details that he had been too scared to recall when we first met. We could now integrate these memories with EMDR so that they became stories of what happened long ago instead of instant transports into the hell of Vietnam. Once he felt more settled, he wanted to deal with his childhood, his brutal upbringing, and his guilt about having left his younger schizophrenic brother when he enlisted for Vietnam, unprotected against his father's violent outbursts. Another important theme of our time together was the day-to-day pain Bill confronted as a minister, having to bury adolescents killed in car crashes only a few years after he baptized them, or having couples he'd married come back in crisis over domestic violence. Bill went on to organize a support group for fellow clergy faced with similar traumas, and he became an important force in his community. Bill's third treatment started 5 years later when he developed a serious neurological illness at age 53. He had suddenly started to experience episodic paralysis in several parts of his body, and he was beginning to accept that he would probably spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. I thought his problems might be due to multiple sclerosis, but his neurologist could not find specific lesions, and they said there was no cure for his condition. He told me how grateful he was for his wife's support. She already had arranged to have a wheelchair ramp built in the kitchen entrance to their house. Given his grim prognosis, I urged Bill to find a way to fully feel and befriend the distressing feelings in his body, just as he had learned to tolerate to live with his most painful memories of the war. I suggested that he consult a body worker who had introduced me to Feldenkrais, a gentle hands-on approach to rearranging physical sensations and muscle movements. When Bill came back to report on how he was doing, he expressed delight with his increased sense of control. I mentioned that I recently started to do yoga myself and that we had just opened up a yoga program at the trauma center. I invited him to explore that as his next step. Bill found a local Bikram yoga class, a hot and intense practice usually reserved for young and energetic people. Bill loved it, even though parts of his body occasionally gave way in class. Despite his physical disability, he gained a sense of bodily pleasure and mastery that he had never felt before. Bill's psychological treatment had helped him put the horrendous experience of Vietnam in the past. Now befriending his body was keeping him from organizing his life around the loss of physical control. He decided to become certified as a yoga instructor, and he began teaching yoga at his local armory to the veterans who were returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, 10 years later, Bill continues to be fully engaged in life with his children and grandchildren. Through his work with veterans and in his church, he copes with his physical limitations as an inconvenience. To date, he has taught yoga classes to more than 1,300 returning combat veterans. He still regularly suffers from the sudden weakness in his limbs that requires him to sit or lie down. But like his memories of childhood and Vietnam, these episodes do not dominate his existence. They are simply part of the ongoing, evolving story of his life. That is beautiful. So we are moving on to chapter 14, and we have a couple more page turns. This chapter is called Language, Miracle, and Tyranny, starting out with a couple quotes, one from William Shakespeare in Macbeth. Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak knits up the o'erwrought heart and bids it break. The next quote is from Marion Woodman, as quoted by Stephen Cope in The Great Work of Your Life. We can hardly bear to look. The shadow may carry the best of the life we have not lived. Go into the basement, the attic, the refuse bin. Find gold there. Find an animal who has not been fed or watered. It is you. This neglected, exiled animal, hungry for attention, is a part of yourself. Okay, and now we are starting the chapter. In September 2001, several organizations, including the National Institutes of Health, Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, and the New York Times Company Foundation, organized expert panels to recommend the best treatments for people traumatized by the attacks on the World Trade Center. Because many widely used trauma interventions had never been carefully evaluated in random communities, as opposed to patients who seek psychiatric help, I thought that this presented an extraordinary opportunity to compare how well a variety of different approaches would work. My colleagues were more conservative, and after lengthy deliberations, the committees recommended only two forms of treatment: psychoanalytically oriented therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Why analytic talk therapy? Since Manhattan is one of the last bastions of Freudian psychoanalysis, it would have been bad politics to exclude a substantial proportion of local mental health practitioners. Why CBT? Because behavioral treatment can be broken down into concrete steps and manualized into uniform protocols. It is the favorite treatment of academic researchers, another group that could not be ignored. After the recommendations were approved, we sat back and waited for New Yorkers to find their way to therapist's office. Almost nobody showed up. Dr. Spencer F., who ran the psychiatry department at the now defunct St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village, was curious where survivors had turned for help. And early in 2002, together with some medical students, he conducted a survey of 225 people who had escaped from the Twin Towers. Asked what had been most helpful in overcoming the effects of their experience, the survivors credited acupuncture, massage, yoga, and EMDR in that order. Among rescue workers, massages were particularly popular. F's survey suggests that the most helpful interventions focused on relieving the physical burdens generated by trauma. The disparity between the survivors' experience and the experts' recommendation are intriguing. Of course, we don't know how many survivors eventually did seek out more traditional therapies, but the apparent lack of interest in talk therapy raises a basic question. What good is it to talk about your trauma? Next section on page 231, called the Unspeakable Truth. If you're liking this video, please remember to hit the thumbs up button, please. That really helps my channel out. And also, if you have not subscribed, please subscribe if you are resonating with this and my other content. Thank you. Okay, therapists have an undying faith in the capacity to talk to resolve trauma. That confidence dates back to 1893 when Freud and his mentor Brewer wrote about trauma, quote, immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked and in arousing its accompanying effect. And when the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail and had put the effect into words, end quote. Unfortunately, it's not so simple. Traumatic events are almost impossible to put into words. This is true for all of us, not just for people who suffer from PTSD. The initial imprints of the events of September 11th were not stories, but images. Frantic people running down the street, their faces covered with ash, an airplane smashing into the Tower 1 of the World Trade Center. Is that what happened? Oh. The distant specks that were people jumping around, jumping hand in hand. Those images were replayed over and over in our minds and on the TV screen until Mayor Giuliani and the media helped us create a narrative we could share with one another. The 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence wrote of his war experiences, quote, "We learned that there were pangs too sharp, griefs too deep, ecstasies too high for our infinite selves to register. When emotion reached this pitch, the mind choked, and memory went white till the circumstances were humdrum once more," end quote. While trauma keeps us dumbfounded, the path out of it is paved with words, carefully assembled piece by piece until the whole story can be revealed. All right, new section. This is actually the last section for today on page 232, called Breaking the Silence. Activists in the early campaign for AIDS awareness created a powerful slogan: silence equals death. Silence about trauma also leads to death, the death of the soul. Silence reinforces the godforsaken isolation of trauma. Being able to say aloud to another human being, I was raped, or I was battered by my husband, or my parents called it discipline, but it was abuse, or I'm not making it since I got back from Iraq, is a sign that healing can begin. I'm going to read that again because I'm being told to. Being able to say aloud to another human being, I was raped, or I was battered by my husband, or my parents called it discipline, but it was abuse, or I'm not making it since I got back from Iraq, is a sign that healing can begin. We may think it can control our grief, our terror, or our shame by remaining silent, but naming offers the possibility of a different kind of control. When Adam was put in charge of the animal kingdom in the book of Genesis, his first act was to give a name to every living creature. If you've been hurt, you need to acknowledge and name what happened to you. I know that from personal experience. As long as I had no place where I could let myself know what it was like when my father locked me in the cellar of our house for various 3-year-old offenses, I was chronically preoccupied with being exiled and abandoned. Only when I could talk about how that little boy felt, only when I could forgive him for having been as scared and submissive as he was, did I start to enjoy the pleasure of my own company. Feeling listened to and understood changes our physiology. Being able to articulate a complex feeling and having our feelings recognized lights up our limbic brain and creates an aha moment. In contrast, being met by silence and incomprehension kills the spirit. Or, as John Bowlby so memorably put it, quote, what cannot be spoken to the mother cannot be told to the self, end quote. That's powerful. If you hide from yourself the fact that an uncle molested you when you were young, you are vulnerable to react to triggers like an animal in a thunderstorm. With a full body response to the hormones that signal danger, without language and context, your awareness may be limited to, I'm scared. Yet, determined to stay in control, you are likely to avoid anybody or anything that reminds you even vaguely of your trauma. You may also alternate between being inhibited and being uptight or reactive and explosive, all without knowing why. As long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. Hiding your core feelings takes an enormous amount of energy. It saps your motivation to pursue worthwhile goals, and it leaves you feeling bored and shut down. Meanwhile, stress hormones keep flooding your body, leading to headaches, muscle aches, problems with your bowels and sexual functions, and irrational behaviors that may embarrass you and hurt the people around you. Only after you identify the source of these responses can you start using your feelings as signals of problems that require your urgent attention. Ignoring inner reality also eats away at your sense of self, identity, and purpose. Clinical psychologist Edna Foe and her colleagues developed the post-traumatic cognitions inventory to assess how patients think about themselves. Symptoms of PTSD often include statements like, I feel dead inside. I will never be able to feel normal emotions again. I have permanently changed for the worse. I feel like an object, not like a person. I have no future. And I feel like I don't know myself anymore. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know. That takes an enormous amount of courage. In What It's Like to Go to War, Vietnam veteran Carl Marlantis grapples with his memories of belonging to a brilliantly effective Marine combat unit and confronts the terrible split he discovered inside himself. And here's an excerpt from this, I guess it's a movie or a book. Okay. For years, I was unaware of the need to heal that split. And there was no one, after I returned, to point this out to me. Why did I assume that there was only one person inside me? There's a part of me that just loves maiming, killing, and torturing. This part of me isn't all of me. I have other elements that indeed are just the opposite, of which I am proud. So am I a killer? No, but part of me is. Am I a torturer? No, but part of me is. Do I feel horror and sadness when I read in the newspaper of an abused child? Yes. But am I fascinated? And that's the end of the excerpt. Marlantes tells us that his road to recovery required learning to tell the truth, even if that truth was brutally painful. Death, destruction, and sorrow need to be constantly justified in the absence of some overarching meaning for the suffering. Lack of this overarching meaning encourages making things up, lying to fill the gap in meaning. I'd never been able to tell anyone what was going on inside. So I forced these images back away for years. I began to reintegrate that split off part of my experience only after I actually began to imagine that kid as a kid, my kid perhaps. Then out came this overwhelming sadness and healing. Integrating the feelings of sadness, rage, or all of the above with the actions should be standard operating procedure for all soldiers who have killed face to face. It requires no sophisticated psychological training, just form groups under a fellow squad or platoon member who has had a few days of group leadership training and encourage people to talk. Getting perspectives on your terror and sharing it with others can reestablish the feeling that you're a member of the human race. After the Vietnam veterans I treated joined a therapy group where they could share the atrocities they had witnessed and committed, they reported beginning to open their hearts to their girlfriends. Beautiful. So that is the end of week 12, you all. We have 7 more weeks. 7 more weeks, and then we are done with this book. This is fascinating and very eye-opening. If you have any comments, first of all, thank you for being here and sticking with me through this. We're at 13 weeks in. This is cool. If you have any comments, anything you'd like to share, any insight, motivation, encouragement for the others that are reading this or are here with us or who might come through in a month or years, please share below. Share this with anyone who might benefit from it. And yeah, again, my booking link for personal readings is in my description box, along with my email if you would like to collaborate on something or you have business inquiries. And yeah, all right, you all, thank you so much for being here. You are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. I love you. Bye.